It was a cold, quiet evening, and the streets were eerily empty. The air was heavy with the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Amid the fading light, a scruffy, skeletal dog limped through the shadows. Its ribs pressed against its matted fur, and its once bright eyes were dull with exhaustion. It had been days, maybe weeks, since it had last tasted food. Hunger gnawed at its belly, but even more than that, a desperate instinct to survive kept its trembling legs moving forward. As it turned a corner, the dog froze, its ears twitching. A faint, pitiful sound broke the silence, a cry, sharp and broken, like the world's smallest plea for help. It wasn't the whimper of another animal or the rustle of wind through the trash-strewn alley. No, this was something different. The sound stirred something deep within the dog, something buried beneath the layers of hunger and pain. It tilted its head, the noise pulling it forward like an invisible thread. There, lying in a crumpled heap against the base of a dumpster, was a baby. Barely more than a few months old, its face was streaked with tears, its cries weak and hoarse as if it had been crying for hours. The baby's tiny hands flailed in the air, seeking comfort that hadn't come. The sight was enough to stop even the starving dog in its tracks. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, just a helpless infant and a desperate, half-dead animal staring at each other in the dim light. The dog's nose twitched, catching the faint, unfamiliar scent of the baby. It took a hesitant step forward, its bony frame trembling not just from the cold but from some unspoken conflict raging inside. Hunger was a beast it couldn't ignore, and yet, there was something else now, a pull toward the tiny, fragile life before it. The baby let out another soft wail, its voice cracking, and the dog's ears flattened against its head. What happened next would change both their fates forever. In that moment, under the weight of hunger, pain, and survival instincts, the dog made a choice that would leave anyone who heard this story questioning everything they thought they knew about the nature of compassion, loyalty, and survival. But what did the dog do? And how could such an unlikely encounter lead to an outcome no one could have predicted? Stick around as we unravel the extraordinary events that followed this fateful meeting. This is a story of desperation, heartbreak, and an act of courage so pure it will stay with you long after the final words are spoken. The dog hesitated, its thin legs trembling as it sniffed the air around the baby. It had been so long since it felt anything but fear and hunger, but something about the tiny human stirred a memory it couldn't quite grasp. Its instincts screamed for it to move on, to conserve its dwindling energy, but it couldn't. There was something fragile, something familiar in the baby's cry, and it kept the dog rooted to the spot. The alley was silent except for the faint rustle of the wind and the baby's soft whimpers. Shadows from a flickering street lamp danced across the scene, giving the moment an almost surreal quality. The dog took a cautious step forward, its nose quivering as it caught the baby's scent more clearly now, a mixture of milk, warmth, and something faintly metallic, like tears. The baby's tiny body shivered in the cold, wrapped only in a thin, dirty blanket. A chill crept through the alley, and the dog instinctively stepped closer, drawn by something it couldn't explain. The baby's cries softened as if sensing the presence of the dog. Its watery eyes blinked open, staring up at the skeletal figure before it. The dog tilted its head, its ears perked as it watched the baby's tiny fingers reach out, grasping at the air. There was no fear in the baby's eyes, only need. The kind of need that tugged at the deepest parts of a creature's soul, even one battered and broken by the harshness of life. The dog lowered its head, its nose brushing against the baby's small hand. For a brief moment, everything else faded, the hunger, the cold, the pain. It felt the baby's warmth, a spark of life that seemed to reignite something within its tired body. But the reality of the situation was inescapable. The dog was starving, its body barely holding on. It didn't have the strength to care for itself, let alone this fragile life before it. A sudden noise from deeper in the alley made the dog's ears twitch. It turned its head sharply, its instincts kicking in. There was movement, a clatter of something metallic, like a trash can lid falling over. The dog growled low in its throat, a sound that surprised even itself. Whatever made the noise stayed hidden in the shadows, but the dog couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone. The baby let out another soft cry, pulling the dog's attention back. It glanced between the infant and the darkened alley, torn between staying and running. Its heart pounded in its chest, each beat a reminder of how weak it had become. But leaving the baby felt impossible. The dog looked around the alley, its sharp eyes scanning for any sign of food or help. Its gaze landed on a torn plastic bag a few feet away. The smell of something faintly edible wafted from it. The dog's stomach growled painfully, but it didn't move. Instead, it turned back to the baby, its eyes full of conflict. What was it supposed to do? What could it do? The wind picked up again, and the baby shivered under its thin blanket. Time was running out, and the dog knew it. But what choice did it really have? The dog remained still, its gaunt body shivering in the biting cold as it stood over the baby. The sound from the shadows hadn't come again, but it lingered in the dog's mind, keeping its instincts on high alert. The baby's cries faded into soft hiccups as it blinked up at the dog, its tiny chest rising and falling unevenly. The dog glanced back at the plastic bag, the scent of something faintly edible pulling at its senses. Hunger was a relentless force, gnawing at its resolve, but the baby's fragile presence kept it rooted in place. Minutes passed like hours. The dog paced in small, hesitant circles around the baby, as if the movement could help it think. Every choice seemed impossible. If it left to find food, it might not have the strength to come back. If it stayed, the baby's weak cries might attract something far worse than hunger. The alley was no place for a creature as helpless as this, and the dog knew it. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a car engine broke the silence, the sound growing louder as it approached. The dog's ears perked, and it tensed, moving to stand protectively over the baby. Its thin frame wouldn't do much against a real threat, but it wasn't about to abandon the child. The car passed by the entrance of the alley, its headlights briefly sweeping across the shadows. For a fleeting second, the baby's tear-streaked face was illuminated, and the dog's eyes glinted in the light. Then, just as quickly, the car was gone, its tail lights fading into the distance. The momentary light revealed something else too, an open doorway at the far end of the alley, a faint glow spilling out into the darkness. The dog hesitated, its sharp eyes studying the doorway. It wasn't far, but every step it took felt like a risk. It turned its gaze back to the baby, torn once again. The infant let out a soft whimper, and the dog made its decision. Gently, as if afraid to hurt the fragile bundle, the dog nudged the baby with its nose. The baby shifted slightly, its small body still shivering from the cold. The dog crouched down and carefully nosed the edge of the blanket, trying to pull it closer around the baby's tiny frame. It wasn't much, but it was all the dog could offer at that moment. With a quiet whine, the dog turned and padded toward the open doorway. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of its decision was pressing down on its fragile body. It sniffed the air as it approached, catching the faintest hint of warmth and food. The doorway led to what looked like an old storage room, dimly lit and cluttered with boxes. The dog hesitated at the threshold, its instincts screaming at it to stay away from human places, but desperation pushed it forward. Inside, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of a refrigerator. The dog's sharp eyes scanned the space, searching for anything that might help. A small loaf of bread sat half-eaten on a counter, and the dog's stomach growled painfully. But just as it took a step closer, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. A person. The dog froze, its body trembling as it watched the figure stir. It was an older man, hunched over a stack of papers. He hadn't noticed the dog yet, but that could change in an instant. The dog's eyes flicked back to the loaf of bread, its mind racing. It needed to act quickly, but one wrong move could mean danger, for itself and for the baby waiting in the alley. The dog stood frozen in the doorway, its heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The man's slow movements seemed to stretch time, every second dragging as the dog weighed its options. The loaf of bread sat within reach, but the risk of being caught loomed like a shadow over the desperate creature. For a fleeting moment, the dog considered turning back to the alley, leaving the bread behind, but the image of the crying baby flickered in its mind. That helpless little face, it couldn't leave the child to fend for itself. Not now. The dog crept forward, each step as silent as a whisper. Its ribs brushed against the edge of a box, causing a soft scrape that made its ears perk sharply. The man didn't stir. He remained focused on his papers, his glasses perched low on his nose, his hunched posture making him look older than he probably was. The dog's nose twitched as the scent of the bread grew stronger, almost intoxicating. It was so close now, just one more step. But then, as if sensing something, the man shifted. He reached out for a mug on the counter and took a slow sip, his gaze lifting slightly. The dog crouched low, its bony frame pressed to the floor, every muscle tensed as it waited for the man to look away again. Seconds passed, the air thick with tension. Finally, the man returned his attention to his papers, muttering something under his breath that the dog couldn't understand. It seized the moment, lunging forward to grab the bread in its teeth. The man's head snapped up at the sound of rustling. His eyes locked onto the dog, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The dog's instincts screamed at it to run, but its legs felt rooted to the ground. The man's face wasn't angry, though, it was something else. Confusion, maybe. Or curiosity. Slowly, he set his mug down, his movements deliberate as if trying not to startle the dog. "What are you doing here, boy?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff but not unkind. The dog flinched at the sound of his voice but didn't drop the bread. Instead, it backed toward the doorway, its eyes never leaving the man. The baby's cries echoed faintly in the dog's mind, urging it to move. It took another step back, then another, until it was in the doorway again. The man stood, his brow furrowing as he watched the dog retreat. "Wait," he called out, taking a step forward. But the dog turned and bolted, the bread clenched tightly in its jaws. Its legs burned with the effort, its weakened body barely holding together as it raced back toward the alley. The wind whipped past, and the sound of the man's voice faded into the background. Nothing mattered now except getting back to the baby. When the dog rounded the corner, the sight that greeted it stopped it in its tracks. The baby was no longer alone. A figure loomed over the child, their back turned to the dog. The baby's cries had grown louder, more desperate, and the dog felt a surge of panic rise in its chest. It dropped the bread, its lips curling back in a low growl that echoed off the alley walls. The figure turned slowly, and in the dim light, the dog could just make out their face. They didn't look threatening, but their presence was enough to set the dog's instincts on edge. The person crouched beside the baby, speaking softly, their hands carefully adjusting the blanket. The dog's growl deepened, its body low to the ground as it inched closer. "Easy, boy," the figure said, their voice calm but firm. They extended a hand toward the dog, palm up, as if trying to show they meant no harm. "I'm just trying to help." The dog hesitated, its mind torn between fear and trust. The baby's cries softened slightly, the warmth of the stranger's presence seeming to bring a small measure of comfort. But the dog wasn't ready to let its guard down. Not yet. It edged closer, its sharp eyes fixed on the stranger, ready to defend the helpless child at all costs. The dog's growl lingered in the cold air as it crept closer, its every movement deliberate and tense. The stranger knelt motionless, their hands still outstretched, their calm demeanor at odds with the tension that crackled in the alley. The baby let out another faint cry, breaking the stillness, and the stranger glanced back at the infant, their brow furrowed with concern. "Look, I don't know where this little one came from," the stranger said softly, their eyes flicking between the dog and the baby. "But we can't leave them here. It's too cold. They won't make it." The dog's instincts screamed not to trust. The world had never been kind, not to it, and certainly not to creatures as vulnerable as the baby. But there was something in the stranger's voice, an earnestness that gave the dog pause. The person shifted slightly, reaching into their coat pocket and pulling out a small piece of bread, holding it out and offering. "Here, you look like you need this too," they murmured. The scent of the bread was tempting, but the dog didn't move. Its focus remained on the stranger, watching every motion with sharp, wary eyes. The bread wasn't what mattered now, the baby was. Another gust of wind swept through the alley, and the infant shuddered, its cries growing softer and weaker. The stranger turned back to the baby, their face shadowed with urgency. "I'm taking the child to the shelter," they said, almost to themselves, as they gently scooped the baby into their arms. The dog barked sharply, stepping forward, its body stiff with tension. The stranger froze, holding the baby protectively but not retreating. Hey, it's okay. I'm just trying to help." The dog's mind was a storm of conflict. Every fiber of its being wanted to protect the baby, to keep it safe. But could it trust this stranger? The person didn't seem cruel, their hands were careful, their movements deliberate. Still, the dog couldn't shake the fear that they might take the baby somewhere terrible, or worse, leave it abandoned again. Then, from deeper in the alley, a sound echoed, a faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. The dog's ears perked, its head snapping toward the noise. The stranger stiffened too, their eyes narrowing as they scanned the darkness. For a moment, all three were frozen in place, the dog, the stranger, and the baby nestled in the thin blanket. The footsteps grew louder, and a figure emerged from the shadows. This one wasn't calm or gentle. They moved with a purpose that made the dog's hackles rise. The stranger holding the baby took a step back, their grip tightening protectively around the child. "Who's there?" the stranger called out, their voice sharp with suspicion. The new figure stopped just short of the light, their face obscured by the hood of a jacket. They said nothing at first, but their presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the alley. The dog growled again, its stance lowering as it prepared to defend the baby. The stranger shifted nervously, glancing between the dog and the hooded figure, their free hand clenching into a fist. "What do you want?" the stranger demanded, their voice firmer now. The hooded figure finally stepped into the dim glow of the street lamp, revealing a weathered face and sharp eyes that scanned the scene. They didn't look like someone who had wandered into the alley by accident. Their gaze settled on the baby, then shifted to the dog and the bread that lay forgotten on the ground. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said flatly, their voice low and gravelly. They took a step closer, their eyes narrowing as they assessed the stranger holding the baby. "That's not your kid." The tension in the alley spiked. The dog barked sharply, the sound echoing off the walls. The stranger took another step back, cradling the baby closer to their chest. The hooded figure didn't flinch. "This is a mistake," the figure said, their tone cold. "Hand the child over. Now." The dog lunged forward with a snarl, placing itself between the baby and the hooded figure. The stranger, caught in the middle, looked down at the dog, then back at the imposing figure before them. The air was thick with tension, every second dragging as the standoff unfolded. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but no one moved, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The stakes had never been higher, and in the shadows of the alley, the lines between friend and foe blurred. The dog, the stranger, and the baby's fate hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of an irreversible moment. The hooded figure took another step forward, their shadow stretching across the alley floor. The dog's growl deepened, its body poised to defend the baby with everything it had left. The stranger cradling the infant shifted nervously, their breath visible in the cold night air. "I'm not handing this child over," the stranger said firmly, their voice trembling but resolute. "If you think I'll just—" Before they could finish, the hooded figure lunged forward, their hand reaching out. The dog acted instantly, springing toward them with a ferocious bark. Its frail body collided with the figure's legs, and the sudden attack caught them off guard, sending them stumbling back. The stranger used the moment to retreat, clutching the baby tightly as they backed away toward the alley's exit. The hooded figure recovered quickly, their face twisting in anger. "You don't know what you're doing," they shouted. "That baby doesn't belong to you." The dog stood its ground, snarling as it positioned itself between the hooded figure and the fleeing stranger. The baby began to cry again, its wails piercing through the tense standoff. The hooded figure glared at the dog, then turned their attention to the stranger, their voice cold and sharp. "You think you're helping, but you're making this worse. That child is part of something bigger than you can imagine." The stranger froze at those words, their face pale with uncertainty. "What are you talking about? This is a baby, a helpless child. They need help, not whatever this is." The hooded figure stepped forward again, slower this time, as if trying to reason with them. "It's not just a baby. That child is being looked for, by people who won't stop until they find it. And trust me, you don't want to be caught in the middle." The stranger hesitated, glancing down at the baby, whose cries had softened to whimpers. The dog barked sharply again, breaking the silence, its eyes darting between the two humans. It didn't understand the words being exchanged, but it could feel the tension, the danger. Then, from somewhere down the street, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the night. The hooded figure stiffened, their heads snapping toward the sound. Their composure cracked for the first time, revealing a flicker of panic. "They're coming," the figure muttered, almost to themselves. Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the shadows, their footsteps fading into the distance. The stranger stood there, shaken, holding the baby tightly as the sirens grew louder. The dog limped toward them, its body trembling from exhaustion but still alert. The stranger knelt down, their eyes meeting the dog's. You saved us," they said softly, their voice full of gratitude. They reached out a tentative hand, and the dog didn't flinch this time. Instead, it pressed its nose into their palm, its trust finally earned. The sirens stopped nearby, and moments later, 2 police officers appeared at the entrance of the alley. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene. The stranger quickly explained what had happened, their voice steady but urgent. The officers listened intently, their expressions serious. As the officers took the baby into their care, the dog watched silently, its tired body swaying slightly. The stranger glanced down at the animal, their face a mixture of sadness and admiration. "You're coming with me," they said quietly, making a decision in that moment. "You've done enough for one night. You deserve a safe place too." The dog hesitated, but when the stranger extended their arms, it allowed itself to be lifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, it felt warmth, both from the stranger's touch and the knowledge that it was no longer alone. As they left the alley together, the baby safe in the hands of the authorities, the dog nestled in the stranger's arms, one thought lingered, the hooded figure's words. What had they meant about the baby? What bigger thing was the child a part of? The night ended with questions unanswered, but for the dog and the stranger, it was the start of something new, a bond forged in the cold shadows of an alley, and a shared purpose to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The dog nestled closer in the stranger's arms as they walked away from the alley, the weight of the night pressing heavily on both of them. The baby, now safe with the authorities, was being carefully examined by paramedics in a brightly lit ambulance. Its cries had softened, replaced by tiny hiccups as it clung to the warm blanket wrapped around it. The dog watched from a distance, its sharp eyes never leaving the child, even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm it. The stranger paused by the ambulance, their gaze lingering on the baby. They felt a strange sense of loss, as though they were leaving behind something they had been destined to protect. One of the officers approached, his voice gentle as he spoke. "We'll do everything we can to find out where this baby came from," he assured. "You did the right thing by stepping in. Without you, and that dog, this might have turned out very differently." The stranger nodded, their throat tight with emotion. Will they be okay?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The officer gave a small, reassuring smile. "Yes. And we'll make sure they're placed somewhere safe until we find the answers." As the ambulance doors closed, the sirens faded into the distance, leaving the alley quiet once more. The stranger looked down at the dog in their arms, its tired eyes blinking up at them. "Well, I guess it's just us now," they murmured, their voice tinged with both sadness and relief. They carried the dog back to their small apartment, the warmth of the space a stark contrast to the cold night outside. The dog hesitated at first, sniffing cautiously at the door before stepping inside. It was a simple place, worn furniture, faintly peeling wallpaper, but to the dog, it felt like safety. The stranger set the dog down gently on a soft blanket, bringing over a bowl of water and a small plate of food. "You're safe now," they said softly, kneeling beside the dog. "No more alleys. No more hunger. You deserve better." The dog ate slowly, its movements careful, as though it couldn't believe this moment was real. The stranger watched, their hearts swelling with an unexpected warmth. They didn't know where this journey had come from or why they had been drawn into it, but they felt a deep gratitude for the chance to help. In the days that followed, the story of the baby and the dog began to spread. News outlets picked up the tale, praising the bravery of the dog and the stranger who had intervened. The hooded figure was never found, their cryptic words lingering as an unsolved mystery. But the baby, after thorough investigation, was placed into the care of a loving family, safe and far from harm. The dog, now named Shadow for the way it had loyally stayed by the baby's side, became a permanent part of the stranger's life. Its health improved with each passing day, its once skeletal frame filling out, its coat gaining a healthy sheen. It never strayed far from the stranger, and in its quiet way, it brought light into their home. On quiet nights, as Shadow lay curled on a soft bed by the fire, the stranger often thought back to that cold alley. The questions of that night remained unanswered, who the hooded figure was, what the baby's past held, but they realized those answers didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was the choice they had made to step in, to care, and to protect. Shadow would sometimes lift its head, ears twitching as if listening for something in the distance. But it would always settle back down, its eyes closing in peaceful trust. And for the first time in its life, it knew it was truly home.